I've already had the introduction about my Scottish accent, which some of you will be familiar with anyway. For those of you whose first language isn't English, I will try to go slowly, but when I get excited I speed up again, so try and just wave at me or something if I do that. This first substantive plenary today is presenting a paper which myself, Volker and Dennis have been working on for some time, which focuses, as Jeremy was saying, on the issues around definition and measurement of homelessness. But just before I sort of get into the introduction to that, it's important to make the point that the work that we're presenting this morning here is only one part of a much wider agenda, of course, that IGH has to tackle homelessness. And that's what this event over the next 2 days will be looking at, not just the research and the sort of intellectual foundations work that we're talking about in this first plenary, but the work around establishing networks of practitioners, policy makers and other doers on the ground. So the work that we're doing on research is intended to support that endeavour to actually tackle homelessness on the ground. As Jeremy's emphasised, it's not seen as an intellectual exercise just in its own right. I think we'd like to start by emphasising the point that the reason why this first session is focused on a common understanding of homelessness is because, not just because it's a preoccupation of researchers as much as it is, but because it's central to having any kind of meaningful dialogue on homelessness, not just amongst researchers, but also between policymakers, practitioners and others interested in homelessness. The reason for this is because without a common language, a common reference point, exchanges on homelessness between countries and certainly between world regions risk talking past each other about different phenomena. We might all use the word homelessness to mean something different, and certainly those that have worked for a long time in Europe and European conferences can certainly report plenty of occasions where we've realised after a long argument about something that actually people are talking about different kinds of phenomena. And on the other hand, there's not just that sort of element of confusion. There can also you can also find yourself in a situation where entire conferences, entire events are absorbed by debates and arguments around homelessness. So we see this as essentially some early ground clearing that's required in order for the rest of the conference to proceed to look at those very practical issues about what we do about homelessness on the ground. The particular task that myself, Volker and Dennis were given was to develop a definition of homelessness that has resonance in both the Global South and the Global North, and to provide a robust basis for the development of global estimates and comparisons going forward. We have big ambitions in IGH. We want to do something about homelessness across the world, and therefore we need a set of understandings, a set of concepts that make sense across the world. In attempting to develop this definition, and I hope everyone has had a chance to at least look at the paper that's been circulated. I know it's quite a long one and you might not consider every nuance of it, but hopefully you'll have a flavour already of what it is we're arguing. In attempting to develop that definition, we've drawn on literature and sources from across the world. We've started, of course, to some extent with the very well-known ethos, typology and definition of homelessness developed by FIANSA and the European Observatory on Homelessness, but we've also built on that partly through critiques that have been made of ethos, but also through work that particularly Graham Tipple and Suzanne Speak, the work that they've done for many years on homelessness in the developing world, and other authors from all sorts of parts of the world who've talked particularly about the distinction between homelessness on the one hand and other forms of poor housing, which accommodates, of course, a very large number of people all across the globe in slum housing and formal settlements and so on. So we've drawn on as wide a range of sources as possible to try to develop a definition that we hope, and we're looking forward to your feedback, makes sense, not just in the global north but elsewhere in the world too. As we explain in the paper, the core concept in our definition of homelessness is severe housing deprivation, which we express as being lacking access to minimally adequate housing. And we further propose that the three domains of home, there are three domains of home within which we should evaluate housing adequacy. These are the three domains that we feel are supported by the current literature, debates, arguments that we've reviewed in terms of those core aspects of home that mean that somebody actually has accommodation which can be considered appropriate such that they are not homeless. Now, the first of these domains we've called the security domain, and that, of course, covers security of tenure, having some sort of legal title to occupy your accommodation. But just as important is what we call de facto security of tenure. That is the chances in practice of you being evicted or not. Because of course people may not have legal security of tenure, but for other reasons may have some degree of security in practice in their home. We also cover the concept of exclusive occupation under security, the security domain. In other words, the power to exclude others, for you to have exclusive use of that accommodation for you and your family, you and your household. And we include affordability within that domain, because of course an inability to pay rent, mortgage and other costs is a core reason for housing insecurity all across the world. The second domain that we consider is we term the physical domain, and that's about people having sufficient both quality and quantity of housing for the needs of themselves and their family. So quality, of course, covers things like having the right sort of basic amenities, protection from the weather and so on, but also the quantity matters, that you've got enough housing for all the household members such that you're not severely overcrowded. And the final domain, which we feel is another important one, is the social domain. The ability to enjoy social relations and also have a degree of privacy which is appropriate in the community, in the context in which you live. But also safety is very important. Home should be a safe place for people. And an important dimension of the social domain is that people have safety from threats, particularly threats from others who occupy the accommodation. Threats not just to the person but also to your belongings, that it's somewhere that's secure for you and your things. So that's the sort of core concept, is lacking access to adequate accommodation in those terms under those three domains. And our proposed typology of global homelessness follows on from that core conceptual framework. And we've suggested that there should be that we should consider three broad categories of people who may be homeless. People without any form of accommodation at all, most obviously. Some parts of the world, including in the States, they're described as unsheltered. In the UK, they tend to be described as roofless or rough sleeping. Other places, they're perhaps described as street homeless. But that's people without any form of at least conventional accommodation. The second category we suggest is people living in temporary or crisis accommodation specifically provided to homeless people, usually by public or charitable bodies. And the final category is people living in severely inadequate or insecure circumstances. And I want to just briefly go through some of the subcategories, some of the specific circumstances underlying each of those broad categories. You'll notice as I go through these, albeit briefly, that some of the categories, and you'll have seen it in the paper as well, are highlighted in green. That indicates that these are the categories within this broader typology that we are proposing, that we are suggesting that IGH should specifically focus on in its work, not just in research but also in the innovation and practice development work. But Volker will say a bit more about why we're making those particular proposals for the IGH focus in a moment. But just for now, the subcategories within people without accommodation include people sleeping in the streets, and most obviously, or in other open spaces. But also people living in public roofed buildings or spaces, such as bus and railway bus and railway stations, taxi shelters, derelict buildings and so on. This is an important manifestation of homelessness in many parts of the world. As is people sleeping in forms of transport, whether that be cars, in some parts of the world, rickshaws, fishing boats and other forms of individual transport that people have to use to sleep in as well because they don't have a home of their own. And finally, pavement dwellers, that's individuals or in some cases households or whole families who live on the street in a regular spot, usually with some form of makeshift covers, some rudimentary cover, though not necessarily. So there's a number of categories within this broader subdivision that we've described as people without any form of accommodation. Next one is people who are living in temporary or crisis accommodation. That includes people living in night shelters, by which we mean the sorts of crisis accommodation where you don't get to keep your own bed or your own room, you have to renegotiate that every night. There's people living in hostels or in temporary accommodation for homeless people, where they do have their own either room or bed on a regular basis. It's meant to be temporary accommodation, but very often, as we know, people can stay there for very long periods of time. We also include within this women and children living in accommodation provided specifically for those fleeing violence. This broader category also includes for us people, internally displaced people, those who have fled crisis of some kind, conflicts, disasters and so on, but haven't crossed international boundaries, as well as people living in accommodation specifically provided for asylum seekers and other migrants who have crossed international boundaries. Finally, we describe people living in severely inadequate and insecure accommodation as potentially homeless. Whether this group or people in these particular subcategories are homeless or poorly housed depends in our view on how deficient their circumstances are according to those three domains that I've outlined a moment ago. But this can include people staying with friends and relatives on a short-term basis because they've no home of their own, people living under threat of violence, people living in bed and breakfast, cheap hotels and so on, people squatting in conventional housing without any legal title to be there, people living in housing that's unfit for human habitation, people living in other forms of non-conventional housing like trailers, caravans and so on, as well as people living in severely overcrowded but conventional housing. Finally, of course, there's a very, very big category which have a very large proportion of people in the Global South live, which is in slums, informal settlements and so on. And the division between, or where one draws the line between who is homeless and who is not homeless within informal settlements is something that's occupied a lot of our time and thinking over the last few months, and of course has been a matter of debate in the global literature for quite some time, and I think it's something we should be thinking about further today. So, a summary of our approach to definition. We do think that the distinction between poor housing and homelessness rests on the severity of deprivation in three key domains that I've outlined, but it is also a political decision what is labelled homelessness in one context rather than another, and it is related to varying economic, cultural and institutional contexts. There's no real getting away from that. So we've taken the view, after quite a lot of debate, that it's not helpful or indeed possible to try to pose a single definition of homelessness applied uniformly across the globe. What's more important, and luckily also more feasible, is to develop a typology of global homelessness, which is what we're trying to do, as a reference frame, as an aid to transparency and clarity that national and local definitions can be considered with respect to, can be set in the context of. So when people are having conversations, you can be quite clear about which categories are included and which are excluded, and avoid that talking past each other. So that's really what we're trying to achieve with the global typology. It's not to say, you know, every country or every organisation in the world that talks about homelessness should include all of these categories, but these are all the categories which might potentially be considered homeless to constitute homelessness, and conversations might be aided by reference to it. However, within that sort of broader agenda of here's a kind of aid to cross-cultural conversations on homelessness, we do need a specific and detailed, consistent definition for the purposes of guiding IGH's work in particular, and that's what I'm going to hand over to Volker to continue the presentation on.
So, about the qualifications and about the definition which we want the Institute of Global Homelessness to focus upon. The proposal is that it should focus on the categories 1 and 2, A to C. You have the green items. That's people without any accommodation and those living in temporary or emergency accommodation, specifically for homeless people. There are three main reasons for choosing that. First of all, there's a higher level of communality concerning literal homelessness, street homelessness, and shelters of various kinds across the world. Second, street homelessness is particularly neglected. International and also local strategies to solve homelessness or to tackle homelessness are often focused on more numerous and better organized groups like people living in shacks or Islam dwellers. And many other international organizations and networks focus already on slum dwellers, on refugees, and internally displaced groups. So there is a gap to be filled, and we think that the Institute of Global Homelessness should fill this existing gap. The characteristics of the proposed approach is it's an entirely accommodation-oriented approach about severe housing deprivation. It's their connections with families, etc., are of course important, and the lived experience of people are of course very important, but they are less relevant when it comes to enumerating severe housing deprivation. So the definition for this purpose has to be operationalizable and measurable, and it focuses on those who are currently homeless rather than those at risk of homelessness. Of course, those at risk are also very important, but it's very important also to draw this line. We are aware of the service statistics paradox, which means that the more services you have, the more homeless people you might count. But on the other hand, we are also quite trustful that in areas with a lot of services, the street homelessness will be less numerous. So we were asked to provide a global estimate on homelessness, and it's very clear that this is a very difficult task. It is important for a worldwide initiative to address the problem and to have numbers. But as our colleagues Triple and Speak wrote, numbers tend to drive investment and can enable lobbyists or officials to direct funding to address the problem. And, but on the other hand, trend data are equally important, and they are much easier to achieve. As we see, for example, in Europe, where we can see if homelessness going up or going down, but we can't provide a European number of homeless people. The current basis, and we have really tried and looked and tried different ways of achieving a global estimate, but the current basis is still much too patchy and thin for very large parts of the world to do that. Just to name one example, if we look at the Australian census, which found 0.5% of the population being homeless in 2011, and compared with the last street count in Chile, where it was 0.07, it doesn't make sense to combine the two numbers or to do any comparison on this level. There are a number of methodological problems concerning a global estimate. Very often we find a combination of incomparable data relating to different time periods, point-in-time numbers, annual prevalence numbers, and to different groups of homeless people. Very often local data in restricted areas like one metropolis are taken as representative for generating national or even world region estimates. And we have extremely large variations in population rates. We have some numbers of the United Nations, which are pretty vague, and the basis is pretty unclear. There are 100 million people, according to United Nations, who are without a place to live. There are 1 billion inadequately housed. There are 20 to 40 million homeless people in urban centers worldwide. That's what is publicly available from the UN. We had our colleagues Graham Triple and Suzanne Speak. They tried to make it more concrete, and they came up in their book, The Hidden Millions, with the following numbers: between 3.8 and 260 million homeless, according to official figures, between 33.6 and 179 million living on the street, and between 41.6 and 730 million living in inadequate housing. Both say in their book, I quote, "This is a highly unsatisfactory range as it is much too large to be useful. It seems that we should enumerate homeless people, but currently we do not have the tools to do so with any accuracy," and we can just only agree to that. We had a European census in 2011 following common recommendations for all the Census Authority, recommendations for a definition of primary and secondary homelessness, and we ended up with 10 of the 28 European member states providing no homeless numbers at all. In some countries, the reported numbers were unreliable or questionable. You probably can't see the numbers, but you can see all the zeros there. You can see that in the UK, they've counted 240 homeless people, and you can see, and you can see that in Bulgaria there are 284. It's not very helpful. So census data seem to be very difficult as well to be used. I think that should be my part, and I hand over to Dennis.
Thanks, Volker. Well, as a trio, we were charged with trying to come up with a global estimate on homelessness. As you can see, it's quite easy to be frustrated. And it's such a huge undertaking just to assume responsibility for trying to come up with a definition. But we really are hoping to open a conversation here and get some consensus. But we don't want to stay mired for a decade debating the definition, as happens. And even in the United States, there's a bill in Congress right now to change the definition. So it seems to be, it could be never ending for sure. But there's going to be a lot of sessions over the course of the next couple of days, a few sessions that will have measurement and definition issues discussed in different contexts. I'm just going to very briefly review some of the common ways that we've seen homelessness enumerated as a way of sort of setting a framework for us to talk about going forward. But the three I'm going to mention particularly are these registry-based estimates, point-in-time counts, and then the respective retrospective reports. The registry-based efforts are when an individual has to declare or go to a local authority and say that they're homeless in order to be eligible for homeless benefits or to get services, or in the case of the United States, we have an information system that tracks people as they enter and exit the homeless shelter system. So people are only counted when they're using services, but this does enable some countries to be able to do longitudinal estimates. They can estimate how many people are coming into the system, an incidence-based measure, if you will, on a monthly or looking at an annual basis. You can also develop typologies of dynamics of homeless service use in terms of people who are in the system for long periods of time, people who are there for brief periods of time, what the relative proportions are, etc. So the examples I'm citing here, like the HMIS, the Homeless Management Information System in the US, Denmark, Netherlands, and Canada, which have some of these versions of this. The disadvantage, of course, is that you're not counting all these people in unsheltered places. You're not counting the periods of time they might spend homeless in those unsheltered places. There are some beds or facilities that might not be reporting into the system, particularly some private charities who don't want to participate in government programs. And it is quite resource intensive. You have to really commit to the personnel, to the infrastructure. You know, this is a sector where there's a lot of turnover in the workforce, and so people have to be constantly trained about this, and it can get really overly complex. I think the US has probably gone way overly complex relative to these registry systems where we could have had a process that would have been much simpler, but that's for later. I actually shoulder the blame for most of that because that was my idea. Okay. Now, but another thing we do in the United States and places around the other countries have been doing it as well is these point-in-time counts. And these are attempting to, the easier part is to count people in shelters because you have people in beds, it's pretty easy to tally that up. Most of the time is spent trying to count these unsheltered folks. So the example we have in the United States under our Department of Housing and Urban Development, communities are required to do a count every other year, usually the last Wednesday of January. Okay, so there's a whole effort afoot that goes on around the country. An example here is the Hope Count in New York City. Dan, one of the people here in attendance, has run the Hope Count in New York City for several years. South Korea has been doing surveys, and we might hear more about that later. But it's kind of complex, but basically you review in a geographic area the different segments, whether in our case we call them block groups or tracts, and they are designated as either high probability, in some cases there's three tiers, high, medium, and low probability of having homeless people there. You might not survey the low probability places at all because much of the country might be that, and it's, the human resource part of this is a big challenge. You would sample the medium-sized places, and you might go to all of the high probability places and count. This is a typical strategy in the United States, but just to give you an idea, in New York City, there were 1,500 areas, and they separated them into high probability and low probability, but they needed 3,000 volunteers to undertake this. Okay, so it's not for the faint-hearted, or you can't just decide you're going to do it and do it a month later. It takes many months of planning to get this thing organized. You have to have lots of community partners. You have to get advertising, etc. But the fact is that the Census bureaus, even in the most advanced economies, are not counting people in unsheltered places. In the United States, our Census Bureau doesn't count folks, and in most of the other countries in Europe, they don't count them. We can't expect in developing countries that they're going to count them. So it does fall on the NGO sector that cares about this population to have to do this, and has to mount the effort with volunteers, etc. So it's certainly imperfect, but it is likely the most typical and common way that you could get a handle on this problem in some way. Just further information about the Hope Count is also in the paper, but there has to be a little bit of training that has to be done with everybody so that people know what they're trying to apply, at least a common approach, and how they deal with when they encounter people, etc. There has to be transportation. It's complex. New York actually, I would like to note, has a decoy system where they plant people who are not actually homeless, but they pretend to be homeless, and then they see if they're counted or not, and then that's used as a correction factor. So another approach that's been used is this retrospective reports. One of the sessions today we'll hear from Paul Toro, we'll hear from recent work in the UK and in Europe, where people are asked to say, have you experienced homelessness in the last year, in the last 5 years, or in your lifetime? And now oftentimes surveys would want to avoid using the word homeless because homeless has different meanings in different places, and many people who in the United States we would consider living homeless don't think that they're homeless. They don't use that phrase. Academics or policymakers may call them that, but they don't describe themselves that way. So instead, normally it's a list of potential places, like have you ever stayed in such and such? These surveys tend to find fairly significant proportions of the population have experienced some kind of homelessness over a lifetime or in the past 5 years. And there's going to be a whole section on this in the measurement section later. Two less common methods, but also have been used as the service-based methodology. Marty Bird is here, who used this approach in 1988. It's also been used as a corrective for the point-in-time counts, so they'll survey people doing that point-in-time count, and then they'll go to soup kitchens the next day, take a sample, and ask people, where did you sleep last night, to identify the people who would not have been counted because they were invisible. They were in a car, or they were in an abandoned building, and then you can adjust upward your count number based on the people who would not have been counted. And then we're going to hear later today about this capture-recapture approach that has not been very commonly used, but successfully used in Chile. And it's another interesting approach. Again, like these retrospective surveys, you have to get a larger relatively large samples or multiple ways in order to get a confidence interval that's reasonably useful. Some ways forward, we don't expect, and we conclude in the paper, that we're going to have some kind of global count anytime soon. I mean, I'm just using the example of Europe and Fianza. They've been at this for 20 years and still have more than half the countries, or nearly half the countries, are reporting that they don't have a number. You may be able to discern trends over time through these point-in-time counts. As Volker has mentioned, But also, you know, probably the most feasible thing is to focus just on high probability areas. If you have very few people and you need to do it, you can find encampments, train stations, and parks in certain places that you designate, and you can see whether or not the number of people in such places is going up or down. That would seem reasonably feasible from a human resource perspective and a good way to start, although you may not be able to generalizedly say this is the total number in a given jurisdiction. Then the idea is that you build momentum over time with these efforts. You get multiple urban areas, you try to get rural samples, and then possibly you can try to extrapolate within a country on the basis of some rural areas and some urban areas to say this is what we roughly think to be the estimate. But you probably can't take an estimate from one country in one continent and apply it to another country even in that same continent. So it's going to take a long time to build capacity and to build this knowledge base, but it's important to, you know, that we at least start and don't feel stymied by the challenges ahead. And we also wanted to, I think, as a group say that we, you know, certainly as Suzanne mentioned in her introduction, the research and counting that's an important part of this effort, but really it's intended to support the practice and policy work. There's lots of other information gathering and research that can be done without having this full count to try to understand the nature of the problem instead of just the dimension of the problem. So we do see that, you know, although the research and measurement is important to get the definition, that we can agree on something and go forward, that if we're going to measure it, how we're going to do it, but we don't want to get stuck there and see this IGH effort, you know, just get spinning its wheels on just doing this all the time. So anyway, we have much to talk about over the next couple of days in relation to these issues, and look forward to the conversation. I think we have some time for questions, etc.
Well, so we have got a few more minutes before we break. That was a very thorough and extremely interesting run through of this one part of what the Institute of Global Homelessness is doing. So any questions at this point for Volker, Dennis, Suzanne? Question over here.
Yes, I'm Paula Gehring from Toronto. Really nicely done in terms of the clarity that you brought to this exercise. Congratulations. I'm wondering what thought you gave to trying to capture and define more of the temporal aspects of these categories. For example, you know, whether people are first time or long time or short time, chronic, episodic. I mean, people move through these categories a lot, and we all seem to use different definitions of what, how to subdivide. Did you talk about that?
We discussed it, but we did not include it in the definitional framework. So we basically wanted to be able to say that whatever the time period you were looking at, someone could be in a certain objective situation, because we wanted to focus on the objective nature of the housing situation and not the duration. So because there's many interesting aspects. We heard so many stories like people who are migrants only for seasonal work into the city. They might sleep on a boat or, you know, in a net, and, you know, but they're only there for 3 months, then they go back. Is that homeless? We had a lot of these conversations. Suzanne, do you want to say? Go to my phone.
Yeah, as Dennis said, we did have a lot of those conversations, and I think the thing about duration and so on is part of the broader agenda moving forward. But in terms of the definition, we did take the position quite explicitly the people who were at risk of homeless or formerly homeless. That's an important part of the debate around homelessness, but in terms of the definition, it was because, as Dennis said, partly because it is to drive enumeration, we're focusing on people who are homeless at that point in time. So that's our initial start point for the definition. For the wider kind of knowledge development work that Dennis said, of course those points about duration and the temporal nature of it will be important as and when we can develop an evidence base on that. And of course Dennis is at the forefront of doing a lot of work on exactly that theme in the US.
Thank you. Is that okay? Yeah, that's fine. Question right at the back, man in that lovely greenish shirt.
Well, I'm Indu Prakash Singh from Delhi, and fortunately I got time to read the paper that written. It's a good paper, and I go by what you're saying in terms of category 1 and the category 2 A to C. I think that's a thing that we all agree to. There are mentions in the paper where you talk about census authorities in India have played an important role in providing some more reliable estimates. I want to tell you that the census in India, we have been part of, because I've been working with the homeless for the last 15 years, and we have partnered with the government census department in 2001 and 2011. And I must tell you that census in India is a big fraud and a farce for the homeless as such. They haven't enumerated the large number of homeless people in Delhi and other parts of the country. So if we are saying the paper and the estimates are right, then the work that we've done in the field, I think some way suffers a lot, That's one. Two is, we have also encountered where we have done our own, in fact, maybe when time permits, I'll share that later. We have also adopted our own methodology of doing service with the homeless, and we have done in many cities of India, Pune, Bangalore, Jaipur, Delhi, Kolkata, Hyderabad and all. And a specific method we have adopted to do head count and interviews and all. And it's a reliable number that we get, and the government does the same thing. The problem is when you mention that you involve police and all, we never involve the police because seeing the police, the homeless would run away. So we would never involve the police, and the idea is that while we say there are about 150,000 homeless in Delhi, the government department says there are only 16,760 homeless people. So you see the difference as such. So there is a data war that happens between some of us and the government as such. So I think it will be very important for us to really see that there are lots of studies that we have done. We have about 30 studies on homeless in the country as such. And maybe we'll share all the PDF formats with all of you so that can be inputted into the global observatory or whatever.
Okay, thank you. And so this issue about the difference between the government view on numbers and the agencies is familiar, isn't it?
This is a very difficult question because we are still taking stock what is there, and we are of course the first thing was to try to look for national numbers. And to be blunt, I mean, it's just a very difficult exercise to get all these and to qualify the numbers, of course. And I think we are at the very beginning to see what is there, but I mean, you just more or less you confirmed that it's very difficult, and that even where we find some census numbers, we will find out afterwards that they are not so reliable. So it's just another call for getting better numbers.
Excellent. Okay. Yes.
Building on Ms. Gearing's comment about duration.
Introduce yourself, everyone knows.
Oh, Marty
Sorry,
Burt, Martha Burt, Urban Institute, and on my own. I want to know if when you're proposing this typology, is this an attempt at a point in time? Is it a week? I mean, what's your, independent of how long the individuals have been homeless, what's the time frame that you're hoping for in terms of how many people are homeless during a 24-hour period, a week, what?
So we have not, I need the translation just to hear it. We have not resolved that there's a particular time period. So as to Paula's question, we just want to be able to say, to what is the objective circumstance that we would measure and say that this constitutes current homelessness. But obviously retrospective surveys are asking a different thing. The service-based and the registry systems are measuring something quite otherwise, and the point-in-time counts. So our assumption is that the point-in-time counts are the initial things that people will probably undertake. Because it's most feasible. We've seen a number of studies from other countries where they've tried that. So we're not focusing on a time period.
Apart from the prevalence thing, the prevalence, a retrospective question, we would succeed to get a retrospective question in different parts of the world, in big household panels. That would be, of course, a very helpful thing. But we would be aware that this is a completely different number from time numbers.
And what you're suggesting then is just use these categories. Whatever and however you do it, whatever else you ask, get the questions that will get you to be able to place somebody in this category.
trying to get to a position of clarity and consistency so we can compare across countries and compare. And of course you need other things to make it comparable. You at least need to know what people are including and what they're excluding when we use the term homelessness. So that's what the typology is for. The counts, as Dennis has said and Volker has said, there's a range of different kinds of information that are helpful. Retrospective information about past experience is helpful. Point in time, who's currently homeless at one specific point, is helpful for some other purposes. Sometimes you want these shorter time periods of duration. I don't think we want to choose just one type of measure and say that's the only one that matters. But the typology should inform all of those different measurements.
But again, the main point is that you still be able to distinguish between the different ways.
And do you want to come out with a set of other things that would be useful to know, like what is this over the time period of, descriptive information if you're going to do surveys,
yes.
Lengths of homelessness if you can get it, those things to think about while you're using this definition?
Yeah, the nature and patterns.
Okay, I think we've got time for 2 more questions. There's a man at the front here who had a question.
Pete Mackey, Cardiff University. It's not a question, it's more a comment, but it was to say, don't be so apologetic about spending so long looking at definition. I think we needed this. There seems to be quite a lot of consensus around it. Nobody's turning around saying, you're absolutely wrong. But
It's the measurement workshop later, though.
We've got 2 days. All I'd say is that we've been having these discussions in Europe for ages, and conversations with colleagues over the pond for ages. And yet you look at that European data, it's awful. Don't be apologetic about it. And if the call is going to put resource behind this, actually, really do make this a concerted effort to work with governments, to work with service providers. We really want to get a handle on this. Otherwise, where's Graham? We'll have more of Graham's books with these huge ranges. So I'd really push it.
Thank you very much. So, a comment on the question.
Just a very short comment. Being with the European Observatory since 1995, I really have experienced this question, what are we talking about, for many years. So ETOS, the European Typology, has helped us in Europe to get a clearer picture between the countries, and I hope this will also help to get a clearer picture across the globe.
Thanks for your words of support. That's very helpful. Now, right at the back, there's a question. Woman at the back there, did you have a question? Yeah. Yes, you. You're at the back.
Well, I don't know if it's relevant now, but I think that we would have the time to discuss further in the workshop. Just a thing that came in my mind immediately when I saw the categories, and absolutely, it was the first thing I saw. It's on the category 3, and it's the people living under threat of violence. So this, I'm sure, has generated many discussions. For me, it's not very clear, and I would love to hear more. Why should we have a category for people living under threat of violence, and it's not like linking everything?
Okay.
If it is not a category, for me, it's not a category.
Okay.
In my mind.
I should have asked you where you're from. Where are you from? And what's your
Greece.
name? Chris, okay, thank you.
Thank you. It's a very good question, and one that we debated as well. I mean, I think as a general point, bear in mind that typology is setting out a range of broad categories as an aid to transparent conversation. So it may be that in some countries, people who are experiencing, say, domestic violence would be considered homeless because it's not reasonable to ask them to remain where they're living. That is true in the UK. In other countries, it might not be considered part of that homelessness discussion, that homelessness discourse. So the typology throws the net very wide to provide a kind of reference point for whatever definitions are used locally. So that's a general point about typology. It's not saying you should necessarily count all of these categories as homeless, but it's just that they are in some context counted as homelessness. So let's kind of ensure that we're having a conversation, we all understand each other's terms. The specific point on violence comes out of two of the domains of home that we talked about, the physical domain and the social domain. In terms of the physical domain, we have in more detail in the paper said that a home, to be adequate, should provide protection from external threats to both yourself and your belongings. In terms of the social domain, we say it should be a safe place in terms of internal threats from other occupants, obviously, typically domestic violence, and also from your belongings. Also relevant to people staying in places like hostels and other forms of temporary accommodation where they may suffer threats or intimidation from the other occupants. So it's those kinds of aspects of violence that we think is relevant to a definition of homelessness. So it's really coming out of those the physical and the social domain and the safety aspects of both of those.
What about everybody in Syria?
It's
because we've got violence. You don't have domestic violence. There's huge arrays of violence in this world.
In the paper, what we explain is that it's about the nature of the housing. So it's about whether, in terms of the physical domain, it's whether your housing physically provides some sort of durable structure that allows you to protect yourself and your person when you're inside. So it's not all forms of violence in the outside world. It's about violence that you are subject to because you have no safe accommodation. In terms of the internal threat and the social domain, that is about domestic violence, as we explained more fully in the paper. So it isn't thrown as widely as all forms of violence.
Okay, now I can't take every question because we're already on it 11 minutes past 10, but there's a man at the back that's been waiting for a long time to ask. So, yes. Sorry, I beg your pardon. You're a long way back from there.
Myself, like you here, I see certain categories that are included. It's initially a socialist country. There are homelessness due to the forced situation. People are very poor, well-balanced services, like Islam area. People live in houses and able to pay rent. The person who live in the slums, and they are enforced. They're born or children and actually become homeless by choice. There are such categories that they are anywhere else that are helped for not included here. And of course, the possibility of society program issues. It's just
Thank you. Okay, did you want to?
All right, so I think that the category 3, which is very wide, because it's people in inadequate housing, includes people who might be in those circumstances. So they could be in severely substandard housing, they could be forced into living in certain areas or slum dwellers, etc. We're not saying that a country could not choose to include such people in their definition of homelessness. That's there, and we're just, all we were trying to do is segment the different definitional components so that when you're talking about it, you can say, I'm talking about categories 1, 2, 2A to C, or 3, or not. So the interesting example for the South Korean folks did both a emergency accommodation count, and a street count, so they did 1, 2, A to C, and they also published a doubled up number from their national census as well. I recently read a paper, just came out last month, from Ethiopia by a civil rights lawyer who was arguing, he did the exact same thing we did. He looked at the literature, tried to find out what should he be included, and he agreed that that they should focus on 1, 2, and respectively 2, A to C as well, because that was the people who they had come together to be concerned about, recognizing that had they included everybody in inadequate housing and in slums, that more than half the population would be included. So again, it goes to your purpose and intent, and certainly IGH is coming into this space because people who are in categories 1 and 2A to C are not really well represented, and there's not really advocacy for them because so much attention is focused, and rightly so, on the large problem of people in slums and in inadequate housing. So it's not to say those aren't important, it's just to say that there's also this other group, relatively smaller, for whom they're literally dying out there on the street, and no one's really bringing any advocacy or focus to it, and that's really why we're narrowing it. It's not to say there aren't those other categories.
Do you want to much, Dennis. I think we're going to have to stop that now. We have got a measurement workshop coming up later. And I hope that everybody has... This was sent out to everybody, Kat, wasn't it? The actual piece of work that our three academics did. And if you haven't got this, we can make it available, can't we? So we can print some more of these off. Do give it a read. I found it incredibly helpful. Shall we do the wrap-up, Tim? Take it to lunch, yours.
Yeah. So we're just so we have about 15 minutes before the individual sessions start. But there's a couple of things we just wanted to raise with you. So first is, you know, despite my nervous tendency toward bad jokes, this is the work we're doing. In my view, this is you know, a deadly serious business. And you know, this is a small gathering of invited leaders with impressive expertise, and there's two parts there, right? Leaders and impressive expertise. So I think thinking about and going into the next couple of days, I think we want you to remember everybody in the room is an expert on something. Everyone has something to learn, but I think we have a duty to one another to speak up. And so I don't actually think there's going to be a problem with people speaking up, but I think bear in the back of your mind that you have something to contribute and that everybody wants and needs to hear it. And the second thing, and when we talk about leaders, everybody is here and was invited here because they are leaders. And you know, I like Jeremy's comment that networking is a lot like not working. It's not enough for us to talk and not enough for us to think and debate. We have to act, right? As leaders, we have an obligation to our communities to act. So I think bear in mind as we go through the next couple of days, what can we do with what we hear? And last, I would say, we're going to have we got a lot of really smart people, and it's easy for us to get into and we want to be critical. Let's think about, it's great to talk about what's wrong, but as leaders, I think we should also be talking about what's possible. So as a way of kind of, I think, framing the rest of the conversation, I'd encourage us to speak up, think about what's possible, and what exactly we are going to do. And speaking about what we're going to do, we're going to go have a break, and 10:30 we get back.
Just one thing I wanted to say before we go. Just Louise pointed this out to me. I just want to make it clear about what the Institute of Global Homelessness is focusing on, because over 2 years ago now, we gathered actually in Chicago to think about the broader remit of the Institute of Global Homelessness. And one part of it, one very important part of it, is this measurement we're doing. Let's get a sense of what the definition of homelessness can be, and then tackle homelessness and bring numbers down. That's one very important part of what we're doing. The very strong research function, and the research that the Institute of Global Homelessness wants to do goes beyond that. That's the first thing we're doing. Secondly, what we want to do also is to develop leaders across the world. So a leadership program will be very much part of what the Institute of Global Homelessness will want to do. So hold on to that too. And thirdly, we also talked about what I rather liked at the time. It was called Experiential Learning, which was pretentious enough for me to really like the sound of. Experiential Learning. Now, sadly, it's been taken down to the more mundane phrase of coaching, I noticed, Louise. But what we were thinking here is how, in fact, great experiences of achieving change across the world can be translated and transferred, and how we can all learn from that. And that particular part of it, I think, is very relevant for today, because we need to go into these next sessions, as Tim has indicated, with humility, because there is so much to learn across the world. And already with this first part of the first day, I've learned so much. So thank you so much for this first part. Let's go on. We're coming back shortly. We're going to have the workshops, and then we're going to have the plenary that Louise is going to speak at. Thanks very much, everybody.